24 years ago this week on April 6th, 1997, WCW held its Spring Stampede pay-per-view from Tupelo, Mississippi. A largely uneventful show, even Hulk Hogan did not appear. But his name was invoked in one of the most memorable segments in WCW history, one of the most infamous. There was a Four Corners #1 contender match involving Lex Luger, the Giant, Booker T, and Stevie Ray of Harlem Heat. The winner would challenge Hogan at a later date for the WCW World Heavyweight title. Actually, I think Luger got the win, and I believe Luger got the title match. I think it was the title match in August. It was like 5 months later when he beat Hogan on Nitro, 6 days before their pay-per-view, and he won the world title. It was this great moment in Nitro history. I believe Luger got that match because of winning this Four Corners match here on this show. But I don't remember a thing about the match. I do remember the promo leading up to it that ended with Booker saying, "Hulk Hogan, we coming for you," followed by a slang version of the N-word. Booker says he immediately regretted it. He almost put his head in his hands if you watch it back. Sherry was managing Harlem Heat at the time, and she was trying to calm Booker down and basically be like, it's all good. She was a total pro in that segment, just trying to keep his head cool, because you could see Booker knew right away what he had done. Stevie Ray never flinched. Stevie Ray had the sunglasses on. He just stood there. He didn't flinch. Neither did Mean Gene. But Booker knew what he did, and he had Hogan as a guest on his radio show not too long ago. And he told Hogan, he said it was the worst moment of his life. He thought it was the end of his career. He thought he was going to be fired over it. And he also asked Hogan, he said, why weren't you angry about it? Or why weren't you upset? Why didn't you try to get me fired? And I'm sure Hogan was probably thinking, what's the big deal, brother? Of course he didn't think it was a big deal. Now it all makes sense. That is one of the more infamous moments in WCW history, and the one I'm sure that Booker T gets asked about more than anything else. 5 days later, on April 11th, 1997, while on a WWE tour of Kuwait, Vader and The Undertaker appeared on a morning television show called Good Morning Kuwait. And when the host decided to ask Undertaker if what they did was fake, if it was acting, Undertaker was very diplomatic in his answer. Vader was not so diplomatic. Now, Vader claims the producer of the show was friends with the interviewer. He was friends with the host. And the producer asked the wrestlers to really ham it up after the host asked that question. And Vader says he was told point blank, toss some furniture, grab the guy by his tie. These are all things that Vader ended up doing. Plus, he got up in the interviewer's face asking if he thought this was fake. He even dropped an F-bomb live on the air. But he claims that the producer never bothered to clue in the host about what he was going to do, and the guy was scared to death. You can tell just by watching it. He thinks maybe the producer was trying to play a prank on his friend. Who knows? But he wasn't really angry. He was only doing what he was told to do. He said Dave Hebner was standing right there, off camera, when the producer told him what to do. He went and he left the studio when it was over, and he wrestled The Undertaker that night, as scheduled, and the very next day, the host pressed charges against him. So Vader had to go find himself a lawyer, but the next day was the start of a 2-week religious holiday, so the courts were closed. He was going to have to wait it out, even though the rest of the roster was able to return home. I'd be shitting bricks if they left me behind by myself with charges pending in a foreign country. But contrary to popular belief, he was not thrown in jail. He was detained under house arrest for 2 weeks in a $600 a night resort where he basically had the run of the place. He said he even got a tan during that time. WWE aired these Vader held hostage in Kuwait updates on television to try to really milk as much publicity out of it as they could, to the point where people thought the whole thing might just be a work. Eric Bischoff said he thought the thing was a hoax. Gerald Brisco told a story to JBL a few years ago that had never been told before alleging that U.S. Special Forces in Kuwait offered to smuggle Vader out of the country before his court appearance. They were going to hide him in a cargo container. It's very hard for me to imagine one smuggling a 450-pound man and hiding him anywhere, but they would hide him in a cargo container and get him to France. And then from France, he would take a commercial flight back to the States. Ultimately, Brisco decided it was not wise to do that. It was not wise to risk getting caught smuggling someone out of the country illegally. And in the end, Vader paid a $120 fine and he was allowed to go back home. The talk show host refused to drop the charges and he lost his job over it. And in 1999, so 2 years later, the host sued WWE for $1 million for showing the footage of the incident on television, causing him great embarrassment and great distress, he claimed. I looked and tried to find any record of how or if that lawsuit was ever settled. I couldn't find anything, but I definitely remember the Vader held hostage updates on TV. I think they even put this graphic with jail bars over his face as they gave the update. 12 years ago this week on April 5th, 2009, what WWE billed as the 25th anniversary of WrestleMania, which was actually the 24th anniversary, but I guess the 25th anniversary sounds a lot better. WrestleMania 25 from Reliant Stadium in Houston, Texas, brought us, in my opinion, the greatest WrestleMania match of all time between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. I love the Heaven Against Hell theme for this match. I was more surprised it took them this long to put these two together for a match. It was their first singles match against each other since their casket match at the Royal Rumble 11 years earlier. They were part of the finish of the 2007 Royal Rumble. They opened the 2008 Royal Rumble match. But this was their first one-on-one meeting since Shawn Michaels returned from his back injury many, many years earlier. And there's a lot of great moments in this match. Of course, there is the botched dive spot where Undertaker almost died. Sim Snuka was playing cameraman, the former Deuce of Deuce and Domino fame. He was the cameraman who was supposed to catch Undertaker, and he did not. He was pulled in the way. He was out of position. Whoever you want to blame for it, everyone involved is very fortunate. Undertaker most of all. You got a guy who's 6'10", 6'9", legit, 325 pounds. Diving through the air, landing right on the back of his head. He was concussed. It could have been a lot worse. He could have been paralyzed. It was very scary, but it's become part of the lore of the match. The fact that he was able to kind of recover and continue on. We had Undertaker, his reaction, that memorable facial expression when Shawn Michaels kicked out of the first tombstone. Shawn Michaels had this great super kick near fall. Very dramatic. You look at the reaction of the fans in the first 3 rows when he kicked out. Oh, this match was just wrestling bliss. We had the moonsault from Shawn Michaels into the tombstone for the finish, which Michaels practiced earlier. He couldn't hit that moonsault quite right, as the referee recalls, and so Michaels was very worried that he wasn't going to be able to hit the moonsault, but of course during game time, once the little red light goes on and you go out in front of that crowd, if you're Shawn Michaels and you're in that zone, I mean, there's a reason why he had the kind of matches he used to have. So for him, it was no big thing. He hit that moonsault perfectly. Marty Elias was the referee for the match. He remembers coming back through the curtain, and everybody is giving them a standing ovation, and he can remember Shane Helms saying, "Oh my God, if there's a mercy rule in pro wrestling, they need to pull it right now, because nobody is following that match." And indeed, nobody could. Nobody could follow that match. Triple H and Randy Orton even said they knew that they couldn't. They knew they were fucked. The minute that match was over, they knew they were screwed in the main event. This is the match in hindsight that should have gone on last. They did make up for their mistake, though, the following year by putting their match on last. But this is the match that should have headlined WrestleMania that year for sure. Also on this show, there was supposed to be a unification match for the Raw and SmackDown Tag Team titles, pitting Miz and Morrison against Carlito and Primo, which was bumped up to the pre-show. John Morrison noted they all found out about it about a week or two before. They were told it was because Kid Rock, who was performing that night, wanted a ridiculous amount of time for his little mini concert. So they had to give time to Kid Rock, which bumped the title unification match. It's nice to see this company had their priorities straight. And Chris Jericho got knocked out by Mickey Rourke after Jericho's handicap elimination match with the legends Jimmy Snuka, Ricky Steamboat, and Roddy Piper. I already talked about the whole Jericho-Mickey Rourke thing a few weeks ago. They had reached an agreement secretly. Vince McMahon had reached an agreement with Mickey Rourke for a match that he would have with Chris Jericho at WrestleMania, but Rourke spilled the beans a little too early on the red carpet, and he ended up being talked out of doing it by his people because his people thought that it might hurt his chances at winning an Oscar for his performance that year in the movie The Wrestler. So we never did get that match between Chris Jericho and Mickey Rourke. 10 years ago this week on April 11th, 2011, Edge stood in the middle of the ring on Monday Night Raw and announced that he was being forced into retirement after an MRI showed that he was risking paralysis or death by continuing to wrestle with his spinal stenosis. He was at that time the World Heavyweight Champion. He had just successfully defended his title at WrestleMania. It took 9 years, but he did eventually return to the ring after receiving an offer from Tony Khan to come work for AEW. Come work for us behind the scenes. We'll let you do a few matches each year. Edge, out of respect and out of loyalty, felt he had to at least tell Vince McMahon about the offer that was made. And wouldn't you know, Vince McMahon said, you know, if you're going to wrestle again, it's not going to be for them. It's going to be for us. It's going to be in a WWE ring. And all of a sudden, the man who was told he would never be cleared to wrestle again magically got cleared. And he made his return to the ring. 8 years ago this week, on April 7, 2013, WrestleMania 29 was held from MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, twice in a lifetime. A show that saw Mark Henry literally fall on top of Ryback for the win in their match. A finish that Ryback is convinced was done to embarrass him. Of course it was. I knew that. I was in the building that night. I knew that the moment the referee counted 3. I said, this guy looks like a fucking idiot. And then, after making him look like a loser, they turned him heel the next night, and they feuded him with John Cena for the championship, knowing full well that this guy was finished. Chris Jericho worked with Fandango in Fandango's debut match, but Jericho was not very happy about it. He believed that he would be working with Ryback originally on this show, while Ryback still actually had some momentum. When he found out about the change, he called Undertaker to ask his advice on what he thought he should do, and Undertaker told him, what do I think? Do it. You just got to do what the boss tells you to do, and if you do a good enough job, he'll take care of you. Undertaker went to 21-0 with a win over CM Punk in what I thought was the best match of the night. I mean, easily. But it wasn't always supposed to go that way. The Rock, if he is to be believed, in an interview 5 years ago on the set of his movie Jumanji, Rock said the original plan was for him to beat Punk for the title at the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view, not the Royal Rumble like he did. That would have then led to a triple threat match at WrestleMania with Rock, Cena, and CM Punk, but ultimately he says it was not his call to make. It would have made for a much better match, I'll tell you that. As it was, Rock suffered some pretty bad injuries in his rematch with John Cena. On that first attitude adjustment of the match, Rock tore his abdominal and his adductor muscles and also suffered a hernia. He was a mess. When that match was over, he needed surgery. This killed off their plans to shoot an angle on Raw the next night to set up a match for the following year's WrestleMania in New Orleans with The Rock and Brock Lesnar. And it's one of those what-if questions that we'll never know the answer to. If Rock stays healthy and is not injured, and he does the angle the next night, and he wrestles Brock as planned, as originally scheduled at WrestleMania 30, does the Undertaker streak remain intact? You know, Vince McMahon said it himself, both to The Undertaker and to Steve Austin when he did that podcast interview with him. He didn't think there was anybody believable outside of Lesnar who could have been the one to break the streak. Now, maybe Undertaker goes to 22-0 that year and then loses to someone else, or maybe he doesn't lose at all. If Vince doesn't think there's anyone else who's credible enough to beat him, maybe he leaves the streak alone. We'll never know. The next day, it was reported that Rebecca Quinn had signed a 2-year developmental deal with WWE, and in August, she would start going by her new ring name of Becky Lynch. Later that night on Monday Night Raw, Dolph Ziggler cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on Alberto Del Dipshit to win the World Heavyweight title in, for my money, the greatest Money in the Bank cash-in of all time. You know, the Seth Rollins one at WrestleMania is more iconic. It's more significant because it happened in the main event of WrestleMania in front of a big audience like that. I was lucky enough to be in the building for both of those. And I can tell you that when Ziggler cashed in and he won, so first was the cash-in, then the bell rung and the match happened, and then he actually won the match, the building was shaking. The Izod Center was literally shaking. It's one of the greatest things I've ever been part of as a wrestling fan at any of these shows that I've ever attended. Ziggler tweeted on the anniversary this week, 8 years ago, one of the most amazing pieces of business in the history of our sport. 4 minutes of an MF'ing Picasso unfolding before your eyes. All because the fans refused to be told who to cheer for. Cheers to you all.